And this is not a presentation as much as it is a facilitated discussion, and it's very, very similar to one that Frank and myself and Jonathan Black and Sam Farmer and who else was involved? Frank, can you remember?
Stuart
Forsyth, yes.
Yeah.
We delivered it to, I think it was the, no, maybe it was a national.
Auckland IOSIG.
IOSIG, but also in conjunction with the HR Institute.
Yep.
So I've actually deviated from it just ever so slightly because now it's my baby, so I get to, and I don't have to collaborate with anyone. But Frank's also here as well, and Frank is kind of like, what Frank doesn't know about the Privacy Act is like, you just don't want to know. He can probably do it word for word, and he's been doing a lot of work on what all the changes mean and things. But the idea of this is not really to go about all of the new changes to the Privacy Act, because actually when you look through them, a lot of them are very sort of pedestrian. They don't have a huge amount of impact on what we do. They're worth knowing, but it's sort of an extension of what you would understand privacy matters to be. What struck me, though, more recently was looking at some of the changes that have crept in over recent years and the impacts that they have over some work that is often done by IOPsychs and HR people. So this is a highly practical scenario where we look at 3 different scenarios and just discuss them and consider what the privacy implications might be. How's that sound? Okay. So the first of these scenarios is about reference checks. So you can read this and I'll read it as well. So you are helping recruit someone for a client or a manager if you're in-house. As part of the selection process, you are conducting reference checks. A candidate who is unsuccessful in the role is unhappy and demands to see the information collected during the reference checks. What privacy factors do we need to consider there? Yeah, I am.
You cannot share something without their knowledge.
Yeah, so the Privacy Act would normally say that, yes, say that we need the person's consent to sharing something. Yep.
The person meaning the people who gave the reference checks.
Well, that's an interesting point. But yes, yep. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yep. Mm. Mm. That's been clarified as well.
Doesn't a person have the right to access to information gathered about them?
Mm.
Not if it's material collected.
But that's where it was murky. So that was the messy situation, right? With the messy restructuring. How many years ago was that? Anyone remember? It might have been about 10. And they were doing a lot of restructuring, and a number of people successfully argued to have information on the selection evaluations provided to them on the basis that it was about them, so they had the right to obtain it. And that made everyone around at that time in this field really nervous, because, you know, what happens if all of those matrices that you're keeping, evaluating people and the scoring sheets and the interview notes and that sort of thing, what does that mean for that? So really what has happened is that it has been clarified more recently, I believe, and as much as the Privacy Act clarifies anything. Frank's laughing because we've had a good laugh over this in the past, because sometimes it raises more questions than answers. But it does clarify that you can withhold evaluative material. So it does what we kind of thought it was meant to do in the first place. And it talks, I'm going to bring up the clause in a minute. This is one of the things I wasn't allowed to do in the last presentation, but like I say, I can do it now. Everyone said don't do clauses, they're really boring, but I actually find these ones quite interesting, and there's only 2 of them, and I'm going to bring them up one at a time. It also talks about, like, one of the considerations I had was, do you need to have that agreement up front whether this information will be shared or not. And certainly in the past, I've always clarified that when I'm doing reference checks. And you kind of know that you'll probably get a more honest reference check if you say that the information will be confidential, but I've always thought it was good practice to normally actually get that agreed up front. But actually the legislation says that it's about an express or implied promise. So with that, we are sort of assuming that what that means is that there is an implied commitment to keeping reference check information confidential. So anyway, just maybe take a minute to read through this wording. Can everyone make that out? So you can refuse access to the personal information if it's evaluative, and if the person who supplied it to then provide it, it would breach an express or implied promise.
And if not ask the matter situation,
Mm.
how is that law?
How did it end up, or how did it sort of progress?
Well, you notice the outcome.
I think they had to, my understanding, Frank will probably know more, but my understanding was that they did have to reveal a fair amount of information that was challenged. And then because of that, there were a number of years where certainly myself just kept going, doing things as they were, but hoping that at some point common sense would prevail and that would be overturned. Frank, did you have any info about that?
It took about 3 years for the amendments to work their way through. And yes, there was private information revealed. It was never published, but it was revealed to other parties. And of course, that didn't help workplace relations at all, because the people competing for the positions then knew more about one another than they might otherwise have done. So the principles which underpin the Privacy Act were quite frustrated, but it got tidied up. It was the Employment Court that overruled the Privacy Act, or interpreted it in a particular way, and then the Privacy Act was changed and its dominance over the Employment Court was affirmed.
So it was a restructuring situation. People for new jobs.
Yeah.
And contestable roles, and people basically under the Privacy Act asked for the transcripts of the interviews of all the candidates. So they could see actually why was I not so.
Which is interesting, because there'd be an express or implied promise at the outset that your own information during an interview would not be shared with others. So it was all a bit crazy at the time.
So there was a period of time where we at PGW after that would then, when we go through a restructuring as a contested role, we would ask people that are competing for roles, are you comfortable sharing your data, the ratings of your data with other candidates? Should ask for it. So we actually got their permission to do it. And I thought they said no. And if they said no, then we wouldn't have to do the role set. And they will say, yeah, that's fine. Really? We ended up just doing ratings. We didn't do notes, we just did ratings. It was just based on unbelievable things. So it was quite new questions when they said, no, I have to do that. Like, oh, that's good. It was very awkward.
Yeah. So that's worth knowing, and I think it helps to understand it when you know a little bit of that history behind it as well. And you can see that clause 2 there talks about that it's evaluative material in relation to employment primarily, or promotion, or the removal from employment, or the awarding of contracts and awards and scholarships and so on.
I'd add that the meaning of agency in 1B isn't immediately obvious. It's just about any entity. It's an individual, It's a person, it's an organisation, it's an official agency, it's a club, it's all sorts of things. So the punishable entity is quite broadly defined.
Yeah, so once again, it answers some questions and raises others. Anyway, so that's the first scenario, that one about reference checking. So now we move into a slightly more gnarly one. This one is about coaching. So who does coaching around here? Yeah, lots of people. Okay, so you're engaged by the HR manager following an accident that led to a worker taking time off to recover. Your role is to coach Anna, the team leader, as she leads her people through this challenging time. Although she is well regarded, some of the team have informed HR that she had pushed this particular person too far with long hours and expectations around a tight deadline. She's taken the accident to heart and acknowledges she has lost some self-confidence, so hence the coaching. About a month into the coaching, the HR manager that brought you in asks you for feedback about her progress, particularly areas that will assist her development. Discuss.
I don't know what privacy factors will do, other than professionally already clear that the first confidentiality is something I discussed first up. So I'm not going to disclose anything without the permission. So what I do is I go back to Anna and say, hey, you know, why don't you have a conversation with them? Because I don't want to or why don't you through my conversation? In the area of performance coaching, I structure it as the first and relevant final session.
Okay. Can I remote people hear that? No. So David's just saying he would clarify that up front, or he would go back to the person he's coaching to ask for their permission, or he would schedule in a session where the three of them get together to talk about it, and that he frequently does that as part of his normal coaching practice.
I always make sure that I'm not done.
Yeah.
That's keep the trust.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. What else?
Yes, I mean, I guess I've been in coaching specific problems. So I'll say to the manager before that I'll get a brief from them what they want. I'll update the progress halfway through. I'll tell the coachee as well. But it's not what specifically they've done or thinking. It's actually where I think they're at in terms of the goal. Yeah, so it's very clear what I'm doing to get off, not the ins and outs of where they're at.
I'm exactly the same with my coaching practice. So I'll agree that I'll go back and I'll say, you know, whether we're making, you know, whether the person's engaging really well and that we're making good progress, rather than actually saying all of the details about what we discussed. But when we were talking about this with the group prior to this other presentation, someone said, yeah, but your definition of progress could be different to someone else's. And it's probably, that in itself is probably worth clarifying up front too, the exact details of what you mean. If you're going to do a progress update, what do you mean by progress? So it goes back to David's point about clarifying up front. And there are some coaches that will actually have a written agreement clarifying all of that, which would probably be best practice, I would say. Other thoughts?
I want to know if Bill has something particular in mind. Has he seen something that he's concerned about?
Yeah, yeah.
Or has he seen good things that might be different to what I'm seeing? You know, there's lots of possibilities that might pop up. But I'd shunt it back onto Bill. Hey, what are you seeing, Bill?
Yeah.
And I'd also have a word to Anna and say, Anna, are you letting Bill know how you're going?
Yeah, I'm sure.
I don't have to do that, but they can.
What was that, John?
Because I'm working with somebody at the moment, and their manager seemed to, like, check with the manager and I say, oh, you're seeing different behaviours. And I'm saying, well, you told them that. No, they haven't. So it's like, so I think actually how do you get close, how do you get that loop going as well? I think it's so key.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes those clever questions that us IO psychs can come up with can actually be the conversation. So like Frank was saying, asking, well, what are you saying? And then like John's talking about with the person, well, are you talking to your manager or is the manager talking to the individual, so just answer the question with a question and see what comes out of it, because when they're asking for a progress update, there may be something else behind that, not necessarily malicious, but some other intent or some thought that they haven't quite worked through.
But I probably won't say Anna's thinking of leaving.
No, you wouldn't do that. And do you know, I had a situation really recently where I was called in to coach someone, and did all of the things making it clear that it was confidential, and the reason I'd been called in is because this person had missed out on a promotion, and so their confidence had been rocked. And the manager was sort of very vague on what they wanted me to do other than to sort of rebuild this person's confidence. And
I didn't catch that.
AI coaching.
And then through the, it was really interesting because the person went through quite a transition during the coaching. So at the start, they wanted to stay within the organisation and make the best of it. But as they went through that coaching process, they decided that they actually wanted to seek another role that was more in line with the one they've been turned down for and stuff. And so that's what they did. And I felt really awkward for a while, because I thought, well, what if the manager goes, well, I asked you to coach her, I didn't ask you to help you to leave, So it was about, I suppose it was about just being really careful through the process, and sort of going back to what I've been committed to, and being a very objective advisor rather than a person who's actually helping the person apply for a new job, you know what I mean? And ultimately, it was quite obvious that there was no place for this person in this this organisation. They'd kept them on because they could, not really because they had a role. So it was probably the right outcome in the end. But these kinds of situations come up, and you can't prevent them all necessarily.
So is there a privacy act aspect
of which one? This one. I just think it's that you can't share that information that you arrive at through the coaching unless you've got permission to do so. That's
personal conflict person, like in their
Professional and legislative requirements on this.
Yeah.
One of my colleagues their thing was, look, the organisation's collecting the information or paying you for information, doesn't it belong to the information? I'm not saying it's the right answer, but his point was, we had somebody paying this was, my manager knows my birthday, I didn't supply that to them directly, I supplied it to the organisation. Actually, should the organisation share it with themselves?
I've had that with 360 on one day I got an executive team for a listed company, 360 on the next, we want you to do this work the next day. I got, we want to know the results. And I was like, that's not how this works. So I had to say, I'm thinking about this work. For me, at least, but we managed to work our way through it and explain how this works.
Yeah.
But I was asked that question, we're paying for it.
It raises a good point though, and it goes back to the Privacy Act about only using information for the purpose for which it was collected. So that's why when I'm doing any selection exercises, anything that is gained through that, for example, psychometric assessment or interviewing or whatever, I actually cover off that, would like to, with their permission, like to use that information for their development should they be successful in getting the job. Because strictly speaking, you probably can't. You can use it without that, you can use it for the purposes of informing your decision, but then not later on for their selection. Whereas you gain such a wealth of information about someone through that process, it makes sense to actually apply it to something else. And just on that, a point I forgot to mention when we were talking about reference checking is a reminder, and I wouldn't have thought it needed to be a reminder until I saw it happen in practice, which is about that the information, again, if you're selecting, the information that you gain about someone through one means cannot be shared when you're gaining information about them through another means. So by that, I mean, if you're doing psychometric assessment and then reference checking, you can't then say to your referee, the psychometric assessment revealed that this person is highly sensitive to criticism. Have you found that? And it sounds really basic, but I've had it happen to me when I was giving a reference check, and a very, very high profile New Zealand recruiter asked me those questions and also said, other referees have stated that this person does this. Have you found that? So I just figure it's worth putting it out there on the table.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
that is a definite nothing. You can't go there because you have to treat each piece of information as separate from the other piece. But it then gets to be a little bit of a grey area about how you then tailor your interview questions based on the information which you provide. But you can still do that, but without breaching that confidence. Exactly. Yeah. So again, if you see that, if they're on an OPQ terms, if they're like STEM 1 tough-minded or something, you might have a question in there about their resilience and their ability to take feedback. But without having to go into the, what happened in the psychometrics.
You won't be saying, and your referee, John Eatwell, what would he have said about it? It might be interesting because we've been talking a bit about psychometrics for Frank to talk. Frank, do you want to talk about the whole challenge to sharing the methodology of the psychometrics? Oh, yes. This
is really interesting.
You want to go back a slide because that's the piece of the legislation that it applies to. There's opinion going both ways on this at the moment. The Employment Court and the Privacy Commissioner have both indicated a certain degree of unhappiness with invisible methods, where it is not possible to establish the fairness of a method of, for example, selecting someone, because that method is subject to trade secrets. The algorithms inside psychometrics, for example, is an example of trade secrets. They're not known to the psychologist, they're not known to the person, the testee, and one ruling from the Employment Court has been you cannot use this. Whether that ruling achieves dominance is going to be really interesting. But what do you guys think?
So the chatter out there is about you should be sharing the workings behind the psychometric so I can challenge it if I need to. I need to understand how this works. How could I possibly defend it if I don't understand how it works? But then, of course, if you share that, you then make it possible potentially for people to manipulate future psychometric assessments. So it's a real catch-22. And like Frank said, you know, we may use psychometrics, but we don't know the ins and outs of how they work behind the scenes because that's IP. Thoughts?
Isn't it where feedback comes in? So best practice, someone sits a psych assessment, you give them a feedback session, you talk through the results, you don't tell them what the results are, but you can say this area looks at, next step that you like to, how would you describe yourself, check in, a little bit different to what I'm looking at, tell me a bit more, where you're actually giving the person the opportunity to discuss the results. My view would be that most people who do something probably get a little bit lost in terms of the algorithm anyway, and then you get yourself into a position where people have false assumptions about how something's actually put together.
I think that's a really good point, Karen. Like, generally, most people will be comfortable with really good feedback, right? And as a reminder, you know, people are entitled to meaningful feedback. Frequently, it's not given, but they are entitled to meaningful feedback, and that will suffice for most people. But there may be the odd querulous individual who decides to challenge it and potentially say, okay, well, if you're not going to give that to me, then I'm going to challenge whether you can even use that information. So that's something that is currently gaining some airtime.
What was the case?
What's the case? David wants to know.
Oh, sorry, come again?
What was the case before the employment?
I'd have to track down details, but it was about a restructuring, and it was about the selection of those who didn't get to stay. And the tools used were such that even the psychologist involved didn't know how they worked. And the judge took exception to that and said, how can you use to make a decision something that when you don't know how it works?
I think that might have been the trend.
It wasn't a mainstream tool.
Karen's wondering if it's the trends field.
I think it was Transfield.
Transfield.
Yeah, but there was another component to that, I think, because the person wasn't actually necessarily doing exactly the role that was restructured.
Yeah.
There was another element.
Yeah. There were other complications. There was also more experience held by other parties than the ones who were retained. It looked like the pecking order was all a bit whoopsie. So it wasn't just down to the psychometrics, and it wasn't typical psychometrics in that we usually know something of which items load on which factors. We might not know exactly, but we know we can work out quite a lot. So as you're all saying, good practice will actually protect you from this particular outcome.
Yeah, and obviously there are a lot of people using psychometrics who have not been trained. So I do think that this kind of concern is probably more applicable to those sorts of situations where you have people who've got easy access to some psychometrics and they're using them, they're punching out a score, and they can't really determine how that was derived, even at an intuitive level. It's just a score. And when you're trained, you know that you don't fully rely on just a score. You know, you consider the standard error of measurement. You know, you consider generally it's a whole range of information that you're looking at before making a decision. But in untrained hands, it can be used incorrectly. So, so unfortunately, that's, I suppose, when concerns like this tend to arise. It's worth keeping an eye out for. Okay, so the last of our scenarios is probably one that I think is the most relevant at the moment, and it's about bullying. Who's touched on bullying through their work at some point recently? I'm going to put both hands up because it happens like all the time. So in this one, you've been called in to investigate a claim of bullying against someone called Sue. It includes allegations of demeaning, undermining behaviour, insults and physical intimidation, or all things that in the legislation tend to constitute bullying. as part of your investigation, you meet with 3 other employees who are considered to be possible witnesses to the allegations. And that often happens in an investigation. You meet with witnesses to corroborate it. In 2 of these interviews, the employees claim that Sue is also bullying them or has also bullied them. And they provide lots of examples of the same sorts of behaviours, but they admit that they're fearful of her and don't want their allegations made known to her. You are torn between the need to provide Sue with an opportunity to respond, you know, in the interests of natural justice, as well as the need to protect the health and safety of the employees, because you've got enough information to suggest that you're pretty concerned about this environment. So what kinds of things do we need to consider there?
Declaration of conflict of interest. I know Sue.
You know Sue. I think we all do.
Yeah, well, I mean, in that circumstance, I'd be saying to Sue's manager, actually, there are some issues here that you need to investigate.
Mm-hmm.
But what does Sue's manager do if you can't, if the people who come forward don't want her to know that they come forward? And you have to give Sue a name, right? Isn't that kind of the natural justice thing, to know the accuser?
Yeah, exactly. Natural justice, know the accuser.
How do you do that?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
asking for a friend.
That's why it's so tricky.
Yeah.
I think there is a way around it, and there's something in the legislation which helps us as well. But I'm saving that till the end.
Well, maybe by saying Sue's manager, actually, there should be a.
But what's the Sue's manager?
Now they're aware of it, so now they're looking out. So they, yeah. So, so you've got pretty good guidelines how to approach bullying investigations, right?
Well,
But it's all about naming the person who's come forward. Like that's
I don't think
exactly.
they deal with the really tricky scenarios that well. They sort of say you need to do an investigation, and it might be good to get a neutral person, and you know, that sort of thing. But I also find that that's sort of where it ends. I think you need to navigate thinking through it clearly. Some of these more tricky scenarios, I don't think they provide that much in that way. Not that I've seen.
Well, then in that case, I would start at the beginning, like finding out what do you want from this, rather than, you know, just because if it ends here and you say, well, you need to investigate this or you need to do something about this, then there are 2 different approaches. Because then you're right, even maybe you leave people in the lurch and they feel like going through the process can be quite traumatic or something.
It'd be the same too about the people who get commented about Sue. So they put it out there, maybe asking their questions. So you mentioned this. What is it? I'm not making a promises, but what is it for you or what is she out of this from providing this information? And they might not say nothing. I just want to get off the chest.
It's really, exactly. They might say that. In this kind of situation, I mean, there's a number of things you can try. One of them is to talk to the person about, encourage them to put their thoughts formally to you, and talk about the, you know, safety mechanisms that would exist in the workplace, and that there are options to keep them, you know, to keep them safe as that happens. But the other thing to consider is that in every bullying investigation I've been involved in, there has been quite a tight terms of reference document. And the thing to consider here is that you could be going off scope to be looking at other people's investigations. So normally with a bullying investigation, you're looking at scenario A, B, and C, and you'll figure out through that who you need to speak to as part of that. If you then go out of scope and look at their potential complaints, you could be accused of actually breaching the terms of reference, potentially. So there are just like so many fish hooks here. But I want to show you another clause. This is the last one. And I want you to read it and tell me if that changes anything for you.
I usually squint on that.
Yeah, I couldn't see how you could kind of force someone to let the accused person of bullying know what they have said if they don't want to.
No, you can't force them. No.
Because there is a reason why they might state it or not, but it usually is a reason of security, of lack of, psychological safety or whatever it is. So you do need their consent. So I'm glad that there is something like this.
Yeah, but also what this says, well, actually, I won't say it. See if anyone else has reached the same conclusion as me about this particular clause.
It can just get worse as well. If they know that they have been accused and someone is supporting that accusation and they know what they say, it's just making it add fuel to the fire, and it can make it just worse.
Subsection A, when it says
Exactly. This is how you make better bullies.
is that a criminal offense, or is that like any offense?
This is not in relation to a criminal offence, is it, Frank? This is in the workplace.
No.
Yeah.
So it could be applied to any
It could be, yeah. Because
if there's a criminal offence, a whole lot of different things apply. As soon as there's a criminal offence, privacy is partially suspended. I've been talking with police about that this afternoon. Yep.
So what this tells me is that when health and safety is an issue, the Privacy Act there is some wriggle room. That's what that tells me.
So does that mean then that you could approach someone, you don't have to say who made the allegation?
I think you need to, just as with any employment situation, we'd go back to the employment agreement. I think with any bullying investigation, you'd go back to your terms of reference. And so mine always includes some sort of reference to if I, through this, develop a serious concern about the health and safety of a particular individual, then that's the situation in which confidentiality cannot be upheld, because I have an obligation to go back to the manager and report that. But sometimes there are other things that I've done in these kinds of situations. So often I've actually been called in to when there's a toxic team, and it's not quite a bullying investigation, but it's a toxic team. And so everything is confidentiality. But in my report, I've said 60% of the people interviewed referred to this person as engaging in these behaviours. And then often my recommendation might be you need a formal investigation of this person. And that's when they need to actually go out and start getting identities and all of that sort of thing. And sometimes that's a good way of actually raising it with the person involved up front before you go down to that investigation part. So that is sometimes what happens. And I think
that strikes me as a lot more defensible than what we saw recently from the Speaker of the House, who was doing exactly the same thing,
yes,
but not in as fair a mode.
Yeah. So I think the way I look at it, because I'm a simple soul, and I look at it as health and safety trumps privacy. That's how I view it, that we have an obligation that if we find out something that poses a risk to health and safety, we have to do something about it. And we have to find a way to be able to do something about it. And in our line of work, we can't eliminate risk entirely. There are some situations in which we can just minimise it, but we need to do something.
Just to clarify, how would you then deal with Sue in this case? If there was a concern for health and safety, what would kick in then?
Yeah, so in this situation, it depends whether I'd recommend a formal investigation. And often in that case, the report, and remember it's not a bullying investigation at that point, would be shared with Sue. So she would know that there had been these, allegations made about her and that they're now going to be investigated. And like I say, that could give rise to a separate conversation. And you'd probably say, look, you have to, we need to get your response to this. But I think you could probably, if it was bad enough, I would go out on a limb and say we are sufficiently confident in the volume and extent of the information that we have received that we believe, there is something going on, and we believe people would be at risk of harm if we were to disclose their identity. I think it remains to be seen whether that will happen and be tested. But I suspect that in a really bad situation you would. But I'd like to avoid that by actually recommending that you have an investigation, a formal investigation. And sometimes you do find out other things through bullying investigations, and you go back and say, your issue is not this, your issue is this. You need to go and look at this.
And is there any mediation happening as well? I'm in a school board, and I saw Privacy Act within a school situation. So usually it's one child who bullied another. But they have this really interesting way of approaching it that is bringing both together, and they can bring whānau to support them, and they create like a trust where they communicate. Like the bully will say what they were thinking, the victim is supported to speak up, and then say how it has impacted, as opposed to you're a bad person or whatever, but how it has impacted. Because sometimes just creating that environment where people can speak allows them to then see what is really going on, because it's not like necessarily they're terrible people, but maybe they have something going on, and just by having that opportunity to have that conversation can clear out some things. Unless it's just gone on forever, hopefully you'll get the situation.
That's restorative justice, and schools are really big on that. And I think what you find is, if I can liken it to bullying in the workplace, so we have our separate legislation, right? And I often find that with restorative justice in schools, it's generally it might be for bullying, but it might not be for a really serious incident. But like in the workplace, you'd often really struggle to get a victim and a person accused of bullying in the same room to even talk. Sometimes the damage is so bad that they can't even look at each other, and the relationship is severely broken down.
So the question to me would be, how can we have mechanisms to have those conversations earlier? Because further down the track, that's when the situation becomes really difficult to amend. But if you catch it early on,
that's a whole new
coaching leaders.
That's a whole new topic.
I always look at the other perspective is educating and having those conversations, communicating, and coaching managers to know how to deal with those things, to bring them up earlier and not let them to escalate, because then you have to go with all these laws, but sometimes it's really tricky. And why come to that situation in the first place?
Danny makes a very good point. Like if you get a good manager would be seeing it early and addressing it. Unfortunately, there is a paucity of good managers, particularly in New Zealand, because the research tells us that we are terrible at dealing with conflict and difficult situations. And
but that's not just at work.
No, it's not just at work.
Yep.
But I completely agree that you at least have the chance of salvaging the relationship if you get it early. But many that I've seen are beyond repair.
There are some workplaces that are very successful with restorative justice, including on things as severe as somebody knocking somebody else out. but that's because they use it for everything. That's because that's how the workplace works. It's part of the culture of the place. What's more difficult, and one of the Sue situations that I'm dealing with at the moment, is a serial situation where for many years in a particular work location, there has been bullying, and the capacity to be the bully seems to be passed on as different people come in to that workplace. They learn that that's how things work here. They wouldn't do it somewhere else. People know what the rules are on these sorts of things. And what's happened now is 10 years later, we've got someone who's finally blown the whistle and has pointed to a trail of double digits, other people who have refused to speak and who have just left good jobs, not because they wanted to leave the job, but because they wanted to leave the situation. Now, we can't unravel that with a single episode of restorative justice. It's a systemic problem, not an individual problem.
Yeah, and we do have a very real issue that people are reluctant to speak up frequently because of the power differential. I mean, I was even with a client today and hearing about a situation, this is an old situation, but they said, you know, someone had made an accusation of bullying against the manager. So they'd done a proper investigation, which included meeting with every single staff member in that team. All of the people in the team said, no, he's great, it's fine, there's nothing wrong with this at all. She's nuts, you know. And she went, oh, well, I can't work here then, I've got to leave. So she left, and 8 months later, another person made a complaint. So, you know, they were even doing the investigation and asking, but the people were, for whatever reason, not prepared to speak up. So it's a minefield, really, the whole bullying side of things.
This is something that I think might be one of the issues, at least, and that's that, for instance, HR very much supports managers over employees. So when that happens, and employees kind of realize that when they're bringing something up, but the conversation is with the manager, which makes certain sense, but there needs to be like a different independent view that can speak on behalf of the others. Because otherwise, there is that power differential that doesn't change, because it's actually, oh, okay, now not only the manager, but now also HR is in it and knows about the situation. But what's happening to the employee? Not much. And then there's the history that builds up. Oh, nothing happened before. You brought something up. Nothing happened before. And so why would we trust now as an employee? So if we get into their shoes right there, it's like, yeah, I understand why they wouldn't want to speak up. So there needs to be like this different body. And sometimes it's like, okay, you have EAP to talk to, but EAP doesn't stand up for the employee either. So there needs to be some kind of, this is the HR advisor or ER advisor for the manager, and this is one in particular for the employees, to have those separate views. Then they'll speak up.
For us, so we supported people in the situation of the university.
That was exactly the conclusion we had for the MBI consultation on bullying and harassment. Actually, perhaps health and safety should be a mechanism to complain about bullying. We've got that, they've got an investigation.
Not everyone is in a union,
No,
right? So what do you do with those
Health and
that
safety in the
aren't?
organisation, they have to log health and safety.
So it's not an HR thing, it's like health and safety.
They
Yeah, I
have
think
to
that's a
protect
good
the
point.
organisation.
Yeah.
And also, analysts, HR tend to, it's either bullying or not. So it's
Yeah.
bullying and then do something about it. It's not, thank goodness, we'll get on to the next thing.
Yeah. And what's that division too?
Yeah, it's not quite bullying, but we
Something.
still need to do something about
And
it.
when it's bullying, then it goes into the formal thing, and then you have to name names, which people don't want to do. So
And even the people who are not the victims, that they're the bystanders, they know that if they get involved, they might then be the victim. So it's all about self-preservation as well. But if you go back to the schools example, they're teaching kids now to be upstanders, not bystanders, which I quite like, you know, and it's about speaking up when when they see something is wrong. Oh.
So if someone reads H&S,
wrong.
someone can speak about that, then the Privacy Act would that information.
Oh, John, I don't know how to work this.
Maybe this could be a way to
Have we got time for a scenario from the floor?
Yeah, let's do it.
Before we jump into number 4, one of the things that has turned up in some other parts of the world to get over the HR aligned to management and therefore not necessarily all that interested in the employee's experience. If you declare a report of bullying to be a safety event, it goes on the health and safety risk register. Then it has to be dealt with through safety and health management processes, which could be quite different.
1, 2, 3. Oh, yeah, there was another. Sorry, Frank, carry on. It's apparently
if it's on the health and safety register, you're dealing with it differently.
Yes, yeah.
And the alignment of power might actually be, well, it just might happen differently. Who knows?
Yes, okay. So, David, 4th example.
I was just wondering, someone in the coaching space, the client has an issue. So, the recent example might be a health issue, but they're not prepared to seek or seek support. They're afraid of the impact that might have. And with me, I'm really clear confidentiality in place. I think there's a harm for others. And so, well, actually, is that sorry, so you're talking about health and safety before the information. I'm not clear what my perspective is. I am just health and safety perspective. So it's interesting for those of you that work for organisations that might contract coaches. What about privacy or health and safety?
360. There's a lot of support wrapped around it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's positive that they've felt they can share that with you and trust that you will keep that confidence. We're talking about it. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah. And that's a whole other topic as well, isn't it, Frank? And we did something about this recently too. I think that was Jonathan Black organised that through the coaching special interest group, was about you know, when coaching does veer into that mental health area and what our responsibilities are there. And we actually looked at including something like that in this presentation, but because it had already been covered by the coaching sec, we didn't. But the conclusion we came to, again, in my simple brain, comes down to health and safety trumps privacy. Frank's had some very real experience with people in this situation, and if you have reason to believe there is a real risk of them harming themselves or someone else, then you would probably be within your rights to seek help or alert the authorities. Where it gets really tricky is where you think we know a little bit about mental health, but not everything, so we can't diagnose. But you might want to suggest that a person makes use of EAP for some sort of other assessment. Yeah.
So what I do is before any session, I actually set the ground rules, and one is unless I will keep everything confidential unless there is a risk of harm to you or others. then I will need to seek advice. Are you okay with this? And they have to agree, otherwise I can't work with them, because there is a moment where there can be, you know, I'm working with somebody and then all of a sudden I find out they've tried to commit suicide. It's like,
where you,
that's clear.
you have to put it in.
We're talking a grey area that's not that.
where you might think that they have a mental health issue, but they may not be aware of it. Yeah, and honestly, that happens so much more than you would think. Frequently,
Most of us have got a mental health issue.
frequently, bullying investigations, I believe, are actually brought about by someone. I can't tell you the amount of times I've gone in to do an investigation against someone, and no one's ever whiter than white in these situations, but I'm frequently finding that the person who has made the allegations is potentially, in my experience, suffering from some form of psychological ill health.
I've got a different phrase for that. I'd just say they've got impaired capacity to do what they might otherwise normally do.
Yeah.
And we don't have to label it as an illness. It's not. They're just stressed out.
And if you really want to look at a gnarly situation, okay, so what I see a lot of is someone with that impaired capacity, as Frank calls it, coming up against a manager who is not the best manager, and it's a recipe for disaster. Yet we are not meant to discriminate against people with, you know, disabilities, for example, and so, and for good reason. But you have this kind of tinderbox scenario that is sitting out there in pretty much every organisation, where the wrong person gets paired with the wrong person, and that is what happens. And there are a lot of those situations. That's why we should all be self-employed, because there's a lot of work. Yeah. Anyway. Yes, 5:31. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrea. That was brilliant.
Okay, don't take me as gospel though. I shoot from the hip, and I sometimes say things I shouldn't. So I don't want to get anyone in trouble. Least of all myself. Andrea said it's okay. Yeah. Anyway, thank you for that.